So this is a great panel to follow the lunchtime talk, and actually we're sort of incorporating together, which I'll explain in a minute. Panel's Teaching Contracts in the Digital Age. And actually, as I looked at the comments from those who were going to talk today, a lot of it was about teaching and learning in the digital age, not so directly connected to contracts, but the lunchtime talk brought that together, and I think some of the comments will be, I mean, by nature, the examples that people will give and their experience is often in teaching contracts, but a lot of the specifics are extendable to the notion of just teaching and learning in the digital age. So we have 4 panelists, but things have changed a little bit since the program was produced. And I'll say just a couple words about each of the panelists now, and then they'll just say who they are as they start each of the 4 presentations. So first we have Chris Kunz, who is recently retired from full-time teaching after 33 years at William Mitchell College of Law, a long-time teacher of contracts and sales. I told her I wouldn't tell stories because we have a long history ourselves going back through 2 case books. She's an expert on electronic commerce, serving on ABA committees on the UCC and cyberspace law, and on the ALI members consultative group on principles of law of software contracts, and writing on related issues, including electronic contract formation and legal issues in online multiplayer games. For each of them, clearly there are many highlights for each of these speakers, but I'm only mentioning a couple that seem particularly connected to the topic. The second speaker will be Debra Cohen, who is a professor at the University of Massachusetts School of Law, Dartmouth, visiting now, but soon to be permanently at the University of the District of Columbia David A. Clarke School of Law. She teaches contracts, business organization, civil procedure, consumer protection and payment systems, and a number of other courses, but I cut it slightly short on the list, and has written on a variety of business subjects. She's a member of the editorial board of Cali, the Center for Computer Assisted Legal Instruction, and has published what was listed as several Cali lessonettes. I'd never seen the word lessonettes, but that's how it was described. She also has been a director of and is really engaged in transforming the academic support program, where she currently is at the University of the District of Columbia, including, and this is where contracts comes back into it, integrating academic support with the teaching of contracts. So we'll go full circle. And so she's really focused a lot on teaching and learning generally, and also teaching and learning with technology. Our third speaker will join us by video, and that's John Mayer, who is executive director at Cali, the Center for Computer Assisted Legal Instruction. He got snowed out in Chicago, and so about 2 in the morning, got an email that said he wasn't able to come. He's arriving late tonight, but he videoed his presentation at that time, I think. I don't think he prepared that in advance, so I'm not sure how awake he was when he did it. But so we will play that video, and there is a colleague of his from Cali who is here and maybe can answer questions that may come up. Anyway, John previously worked at the Chicago Kent College of Law as Director of Computing Services. He was also profiled in, as was mentioned at lunch, in 2013 by the ABA Journal as a legal rebel. And in 2012 was named a champion of technology by Law Technology News, recognizing outstanding achievements of legal professionals in use of technology. Apparently he's also known for unique presentations at Cali's annual conference, including showing up as a Lego man with a red plastic head. I don't know if he did that for the video. We'll see when we pull it up. And then our fourth speaker was to be Ben Templin, but he got bumped from the red eye coming from San Diego and wasn't able to make it either. So replacing Ben on the panel is Kingsley Martin from the lunchtime presentation, thinking that this would actually round things out so he can either add some comments or answer questions so we can continue that conversation about how to use technology. So I will make my way to the other end of the table, and Chris Coons will start, and it should be a lively conversation.
Thanks. First, let me say I'm not going to offer any magic bullets here. My perspective here is to try to separate out why technology matters in teaching. What difference does it make? It's not the magic bullet. It's not the end-all and be-all. For about 2.5 decades, I've studied internet and computer law. And like most of my ABA colleagues in the business law section, we've taken the idea that these kinds of technology development should be governed by media neutral law if we can do it. And it's only if the media change, the technology poses a truly new problem, that you have to come up with a new rule. But otherwise, if you can govern things with media neutral principles, you don't have threshold battles over whether you're governed by Rule 1A or 1B at the outset. And I think the same thing is true of the law school classroom. A lot of what we do, whether it's put things up on Blackboard or direct students to websites, are really media neutral. They just happen to be electronic or they happen to be in paper, but they don't fundamentally change the teaching setting. And more often, the technology just introduces glitches and distractions. Students are wowed by the YouTube video you show at the beginning of class, but are they concentrating on anything else for the next 10 minutes as they watch all the accompanying YouTubes on the same page? And also, it's the day when you walk in and you really need the technology, which is the day when your tech doesn't work. So I'm always walking into the classroom with Plan A and Plan B, just in case the tech stuff doesn't end up working for me. My other kind of point of skepticism is to resist labeling our students a particular generation. I think when you label students as Gen X or Gen Y or whatever, you're largely stereotyping and setting sort of artificial boundary lines around a particular age group when there aren't any sharp lines in reality. And that kind of artificial grouping tends to obscure longer-term trends, these sort of gradual but still discernible changes in law students over the decades. And in addition, when you start to label a particular generation as something or something else, you're kind of missing the point about the observer who does the labeling. So in our case, if we're thinking of our students as a different generation, what does that say about us? And we've slipped off into a different generation, so maybe we should look at ourselves as much as we're looking at our students' capabilities and shortfalls based on this sort of grouping. So I'm not going to try to do that sort of grouping and labeling and thinking about this sort of digital natives, because what we've had is a gradual trend that's been occurring going back to, the sort of really primitive online games and so on to the very sophisticated versions and all of these sort of different messaging. But it's happened very gradually, and it's happened involving all of us. It's just some of us have had more exposure to it, but not necessarily based on how old we are. Law students are still struggling with being novices to a new discourse, the cognitive psychology term for students' discomfort of trying to figure out a brand new area of study. They've got to figure out the vocabulary, the structure, the politics, the policies underlying all of these areas. And novices to the legal discourse are still struggling with the same things. They're trying to drink from this fire hose that is the first semester of law school, and I will come back to the fire hose often. They're trying to figure out how to prepare adequately but not overkill in terms of how to prep for class and how to prep for exams. They don't know how to regulate the pendulum swing between way too little and way too much, and we watch them go back and forth a lot, especially in the first semester. And related to that, they have a hard time feeling confident about their preparation for class and exams. They have an increasing problem, which I'll talk about more in a minute, of evaluating which of the outside sources and outside supplements and outside search engines have credibility, have cred in sort of the street term of it. So we need to sort of work on how to figure out how to teach them that credibility skill. They always have the problem with the initial misconception that there's a rule on point or a case on point. If they could just find it, they could solve it and be done with it and move on to the next thing. And they have a lot of trouble figuring out the relationship between rules and analogies and policies, and so on and so forth. It's a huge list. These are all sort of just standard novice to the discourse problems. Eventually, most of them get by most of them, and we try to help as much as we can. But in maybe about the last 10 to 15 years, our students have incrementally changed in the following ways, and it's these kinds of changes that I want to focus on, and also that I welcome you to think about ways in which the technology really has changed students in ways that change the teaching learning moment. Firstly, they have access to more and more electronic sources and search methods. many of which are less traditional, less tested, less monitored, less published in traditional ways. So they can sometimes find the answer more easily, but they can also get misled more easily. Because of that kind of proliferation of electronic searches and electronic search methods, the students now, I think, have to learn how to drink from an even larger fire hose. There's more stuff out there, and they're used to going out there and looking for more stuff from their previous lives in undergrad and even K-12 education. And so they have a harder and harder time, I think, figuring out how to slim down their inquiries into to having manageable parameters associated with them. Third point, compared with law school professors, law students have more exposure to and experience with educational technology. This is a bummer, but it's always going to be true. They've been sitting out there in K-12 and undergrad and sometimes graduate school. They have encountered more teachers than we have who have taught with various means of technology. And this will continue to be true as long as we're teaching and everybody else is teaching. So to some extent, we've got to be humble to our students in terms of the amount of experience and expectations that they come in with. I've got a humble idea of how to alleviate some of this, but this is always going to be a difference between us and our students. Students now have far easier access to their professors, and so we've all experienced that sort of 24/7 expectation of, why didn't you answer my text that I sent you at 2 in the morning? And no, you can't have Sunday off, and I say I can too. I get to take 2 days off a weekend. You just don't get to. Students also have easier access to their classmates, to the students ahead of them who already took the course, and even graduates and attorneys, much more so than when we were in law school. But they also can, again, get more easily misled, and sometimes as a group. In some ways, I feel like I'm seeing the Borg emerge from the sort of Star Trek idea, where our students are so electronically interconnected with each other that occasionally when I start class, I feel like I'm looking at an interconnected web, and they've all decided on what the right answer is, and God help me if they're wrong. And that's a very new thing coming into the classroom that didn't used to be there, and it's happening more often. Law students have greater opportunities to collaborate with their classmates, even when they're more in danger and becoming more isolated behind their laptops and their screens. On the other hand, too much collaboration, communication can have its downsides, and I do want to talk about that issue as well. So what do these observations tell us about our teaching priorities in terms of teaching contracts in this digital age? And I just want to offer a couple suggestions, and then I will eagerly listen to my co-panelists. But I think, firstly, one point is to help turn down the spigot on the fire hose. We need to give our students the chance to have more guidance on how to prepare for class and how to assess when they're adequately prepared. It didn't used to be so necessary because there were standard things that got passed on from student to student and from class to class. But I feel like this sort of broadening of possibilities out there on the web and out there on intranets and out there on various other sources that even other people that students have access to means that this sort of wider proliferation of sources means that we should give that greater guidance on how they should prepare for class and what doesn't seem to work so well. Not to artificially tamp it down, but at least to sort of narrow the bounds a little bit. One of the things that Carol and I have done in our contracts textbook is to include this sort of list of reading questions before every single case or codified provision so that students have a baseline, that when I finish these questions, if I sort of understand the basic contours, I know I'm well enough prepared. And after doing that for, 5, 6, 10, 12 weeks, they do have a better sense of, oh yeah, when I encounter these kinds of cases or codified provisions, this is the kind of preparation I need to do. And if I'm coming out short, I need to drill down deeper. And then we also include these little in-depth questions in boxes at the location where the text seems to trigger that question or observation. This isn't so much to give a plug for the book, it's to say that this is one way in which, whether you do it electronically or whether you do it in paper, you do give your students that sort of pre-reading feedback about, not feedback, pre-reading input about what your expectations are in terms of critical reading, and this lines up with the critical reading literature out there about giving students a clue about what they should be reading for and what they don't need to particularly read for. Another way to turn down the fire hose is to be much more upfront about teaching students how to assess the credibility of these outside sources and search methods, whether it's classmates or upperclassmen or traditional paper sources or websites or blogs, law firm postings on certain things. What kinds of things do we find to be credible, and which things do we turn away from almost instantly? When do we, as problem solvers in this area, look to find the same answer by 2 or 3 different avenues before we trust what we find out there? And when is it that we go to a certain place, look up the answer, and walk away with just a single inquiry? I find myself doing much more of that sort of double and triple problem solving when I'm operating on the web. But if I pull out Farnsworth and I see that he says a certain thing there and I don't know that the law has changed since then, I do kind of have a tendency to go with a single inquiry there. So give those kinds of feedback to your students about when do you go and do the extra mile, and when is it that a relatively simple research method will actually work for this kind of a problem. It doesn't work across the board. Once your students know how to prepare adequately for class and how to assess that on their own without looking to you for feedback, then they can start to figure out which sources and search methods are reliable, and they can start to turn down their own fire hose spigot. And when they do that, everything gets easier. Class discussion starts to get more focused. Study groups run better outside of class. Small group exercises work better because there aren't those sort of wacky ideas coming in from the side. Well, I read this blog. Well, what do I do about that? I don't know. Students don't have those kinds of difficulties working with each other so much. So this teaching of credibility, I think, has a lot in terms of sort of tamping down the sort of excess of noise coming in from the outside. Another teaching priority ought to be to use technology to encourage students to work collaboratively when the collaboration assists in the learning, such as when they have to listen to those wacky ideas out there and actually evaluate and possibly refute each other's arguments. Again, this calls for more credibility evaluation, and it's a good thing for students to be engaging in. Also, in that sort of small group collaboration, you can get struggling students who start to learn from students who are grasping the material better. And also in situations where the product of the group is far more than the individual students could have accomplished on their own. A brainstorming session is a really good illustration of that. But I want to say that this doesn't mean we should encourage collaboration all the time. There's a really interesting body of research out there that I actually taught at orientation for a couple years at William Mitchell. And that was this body of research on how much students are multitasking too much and how that multitasking takes away their ability to really concentrate and read critically and carefully and deeply. And in fact, so many of them have been multitasking while they're studying that a lot of them, I think, come to law school without knowing how to do this sort of deep, careful, critical reading. So to start to talk to my students, I talk about turning off the accompanying YouTube clips that they're watching while they're reading their contracts books, the Facebook side panel, the Netflix that they've got on the TV across the room. How much stuff is coming into their channel at one time? Research shows that for every single person out there, there are no exceptions to this, that everybody's speed, accuracy, comprehension, and creativity decreases as they juggle more tasks. And with our technology-prone students, they're doing it a lot. This analytical portion of the brain that's so critical to yours and my work and to their work as well has only one channel, and every time it has to flip to another subject, it has to flip back. So it takes a little notice of the Netflix, and then it comes back to contracts. It takes a little notice of the Facebook message that came in, and then it comes back again. And students who think that they're great multitaskers, there's a Stanford study that says they are the worst. They're absolutely the worst out there. The people who are cautious about multitasking are actually far better at it for some reason. It's the people who have been multitasking forever who lose the most on comprehension, accuracy, speed, and creativity. Many of your students are juggling not only their class prep, but also even writing projects and other things that really make a difference, like exam preparation. And so it's taking a toll on their intellectual capital. As a professor, you might think about raising it. It was a good setting for me to do it in that orientation session, but I've raised it in class as well, and I've raised it in a lot of student conferences. I asked students to describe to me accurately their study setting, and how many tiles are up on their computer at one time, and how much are they checking their cell phone even while they're reading this stuff, and how much are they letting people come in and even interrupt them, the non-technology interruptions, because I think it does make a big difference. One last idea, sort of in terms of dealing with technology in the classroom, is how to bridge this divide between the fact that your students have more exposure to educational technology than you do, and that is that you go back to school yourself. My absolutely favorite sabbatical was that I went back to undergrad, and I took all the courses that I didn't give a rip about when I was a molecular biology major. When I was in undergrad, I was just trying to minimize all of the social sciences and all of the humanities to just get the most number of science credits I could get and the least number of everything else. But now that I was a law professor, I really cared about logic. I actually thought rhetoric was a good idea. I took philosophy, I took cognitive psychology, semantics, syntax, communication theory. It was fabulous. There are very few people in teaching who wouldn't enjoy that experience. And it took me about 6 weeks to learn to just sit back and enjoy the ride because I didn't have to run the classroom. But I got to do a 2-semester sabbatical doing this. So I sat in freshman logic class and watched my prof administer 6 exams over the semester, each of which had a practice exam before it with a sampling of what kinds of questions he was taking. And we got to take that practice exam and get feedback on it and then take the real thing. In cognitive psychology class, I got to work with 5 students to write a group written paper every single week, and we did it electronically. We were rarely in the same room with each other. In philosophy course, I got to panic with my classmate when the buggy software prevented us from joining a mandatory synchronous discussion group online, and we had to be there by 4 o'clock and we couldn't get in. And I had all sorts of other papers I turned in that I got back electronically. And this was 99-2000. By now, in 2014, this would be a really interesting experience. If you can't take a semester, think about a summer. Think about taking just a couple courses, because you will get the sense of where your students are coming from. These are the very students who are going to be sitting in your classroom in another year or 2 or 3. And they have really interesting viewpoints, and they're surprisingly open to having a law professor in their study group. And so I would sit there and I'd say, well, what kind of apps are you using? Where's your software? What are you looking at? How are you taking notes? How are you culling down those notes to prepare your exam material? What do you think's working well for you and what isn't? It was a blast. It was absolutely fun. So if you do it, you'll come back to teaching with a boatload of new ideas. And with that thought, I'll turn things over to my fellow panelists.
Okay, well, we did not get a chance to really coordinate our talks beforehand, except for a couple of emails, but it's amazing on how many of the ideas that are going to correspond. Somewhere not too long ago, I woke up one day and realized I'd been at this for more than 20 years, and I'm really not sure how that happened. When I went into teaching, it was one of those things I did. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to start with I'm Deb Cohen in case you came in late. When I went into teaching, people said, well, why teaching? And well, one of the reasons was my law professor had been telling me for 5 years I needed to do this, but the other reason was I came from this family. I'm one of 3 girls, and half my family is lawyers, and half my family is teachers, and someone had to split the difference. And since I'm the middle child, I'm the one. So I am half a lawyer and half a teacher, hence a law professor. It's perfect, right? And when I went into teaching, I was a mergers lawyer who was put into a Civ Pro class. I have never litigated a day in my life, nor do I intend to, but I taught Civ Pro for the first 10 years of my teaching career. And believe me if I tell you that my major concern was, oh my God, I have to walk into this class and teach things like pleading and joinder, and I haven't a clue. And so I spent an incredible amount of time making sure I could teach substance. incredible amount of time, which was good. I learned my substance, and so did they, probably better than ever, because I had to learn it and break it down, and I was on their level. But somewhere after the first couple of years, I realized that the substance of the name of the class I'm teaching wasn't really my goal. That my goal as a teacher was really much more, and that the substance, the title of my class, was my vehicle. So when I was teaching Civ Pro, I was using Civ Pro to teach them that horrible expression, how to think like a lawyer, which means slightly different things to all of us. And then I moved on to contracts, which made much more sense for me. And again, I'm using the vehicle of contracts to teach them all of these skills I think they need to do to go out and be lawyers. How to read the law, how to think about the law, how to problem solve, how to reflect on it all, and all of the soft skills that go along with lawyering. So I began to realize that contracts was my vehicle, Civ Pro was my vehicle, whatever I was teaching, and as you heard, it's been a long list of 7 or 10 classes, most of which were taught in the first 4 years of teaching. When I started teaching 20 plus years ago, they were my peers. And somewhere along the line, they seemed to change. Now, we've all gotten a little older. I've just gotten much older than they have. Their average age has gone up, but mine has gone up much more substantially than theirs had. And I began to think, am I just becoming my parents and my grandparents? I have to walk in the cold, uphill, both ways in the snow to school. And I did, a mile each way. My nieces got driven, but okay. But I did, or was there really a change? And as was pointed out, if we talk about generations, we have to look to ourselves, not just to the other generation. So I think it's a little of both. But what I want to talk about is this digital native versus digital immigrant concept, because I think that has played an incredible role in what's happening in the classroom. And I've looked at lots of things, and I think each of them plays a role, and no single one is perfect, and they all involve generalizations and stereotypes. But it's a good place to start the conversation, because no matter what we want to do with our students, we have to take them where they start. We may not like it, but that's where they are, and if we try to start too far ahead of them, they're not coming with us. Because teaching is only part of the equation. They need to learn. That's how you get to the conclusion, the success that we're looking for. So I started trying to figure out what is it that may have changed about my students besides the fact that I just could be their mother now instead of their peer. Okay, and what I realized is that whereas generation theory talks about the fact that very generalized ideas get created based on the society and the economics and the technology in which we are raised. And that was the part that I found was really interesting, because we're all raised with some new technology. And if it's new to us, then it's technology. If you're raised and it's just there, it's a part of life. Well, the students we have in our classroom today are what they call digital natives. The vast majority of them have grown up with computers and digital technology in their lives from a very young age. They've had it in elementary school. And so they have been dealing with the technology as a part of life, sort of the way that my grandparents would say we dealt with the phone and the automobile, and my grandparents were getting the first cars. So that is in and of itself one of the things. So I started doing some research on this concept of digital native versus digital immigrant. And digital natives are people that were born into the technology. But there are 3 categories. It's a spectrum, just like most of law, right? There are the few that try to avoid it. They don't like it. There are some that are minimalist. They take what they need and they use it. And then there are the enthusiasts, and a lot of us see them in our classrooms, the ones that have their smartphone constantly going and the 6 tiles on their window. Okay, then there are the immigrants, and most of the people in this room are immigrants. And there are the immigrants who are the avoiders. I don't know if you have one on your faculty. I still have one on my soon-to-be former faculty. The admin has to turn on his computer and print out his email. Will not do it. Okay? Then there are the digital immigrants who are reluctant. They come kicking, screaming, whining, but they come. They use it. They do their email now. They don't Twitter or I don't Twitter. I don't twerk either, and my students wanted to do, I always use the example of you can accept the contract by doing the hokey pokey, and they wanted me to twerk, and I'm like, haven't been there, not going there. We can do the alley cat, we can do the hokey pokey, we're not doing twerking. But there are the digital immigrants who are the reluctant adopters, and then there are the enthusiasts. Okay? I'm probably an enthusiast. I started programming in 1981 in college, and I was on ARPANET and BitNet back chatting and relaying before chat rooms and stuff existed. So I am probably one of the enthusiasts. But even so, I don't like PowerPoint. I don't necessarily like technology when I'm having a conversation. I don't even like the screen here because I like my eye contact. I like my interaction. And I also can't sit still. So we'll just start with a couple questions. How do you get in touch with your friends? How many people still write letters? Okay, yeah. My 10-year-old niece and I actually have a pen pal relationship, U.S. postal stamps. How many just pick up the phone and call? Email? Chat? Text, other than your children or your grandkids, because that's the only way they'll get to you. My mom is texting now. My 75-year-old mother texts because that's how her grandchildren respond. So there we seem to bridge a gap pretty well. But what about a book? How many people have read a book in the last few months besides law books? That cut it down. Okay, a real book, or did you read it on Kindle or online? Both. Okay, so we're really all bridging the gaps. If you think about it, you grew up, how many children today know what it means to dial a phone? Right? And I remember watching Katharine Hepburn movies with Spencer Tracy and the room full of vacuum tubes for computers. And I remember my first desktop in 1985. I was in law school, and it had 2 5¼ floppy disks. And WordPerfect fit on one of them. It was WordPerfect 4 when they went to 2. Growing up, maybe you had the phonograph or the 8-track player. Or maybe you got very cool and you got a Walkman so that you could listen on cassettes. And then the CD came out, and now they all listen on their little nano iPods. Right? So there are these progressions. The television, my mother finally made him get rid of it, had one of the original 1930 tube TVs, to now the flat screens. And how many people even really watch TV anymore? Are they all DVR it or watch it on Netflix or downloading it? So these things are very different. But where did you go for your information? If you needed to look something up, did you all have the Encyclopedia Britannica or World Book in your house? We had the World Book. And they came with the yearly update. Very cool. Okay, if you didn't, you had to go to the library, right? Most of these people pick up their iPad, their iPhone, and that's their library. They have access. Digital natives have never thought about having to wait for the library to open. Or it's Sunday and the library is closed. You really should have planned that paper before. That's what my mother said. So they are shown cognitively by the scientists to have actually grown up with a different set of stimuluses, and their brains are wired differently. They light up differently when they run these, don't do it, it's probably not good for you, the PET scans of how they're learning, all these visual images and computer games and everything else. So how is it that it appears to me that these digital natives might be different than we digital immigrants? They are connected 24/7. They don't understand leaving the cell phone downstairs or turning off the ring, which I do all the time. Wait. They tended to learn things using video game gamification and trial and error. They'll go back and try the same level 1,000 times until they figure out how to do it. And then they go on to the next. People prior to computers didn't tend to use that form of trial and error to figure things out. It was a much more logical progression. The other, hypertext. They're not used to reading things in a linear order, though God forbid you try to take a chapter out of order in the textbook, they still get upset. But if it's hypertext on a screen, they're happy to jump around. They are. So they have not been raised with the same linear step-by-step progressions. They are not necessarily used to knowing things for the sake of knowing them because you can't necessarily get access to them. They grew up with so much information overload that they think, or at least some of the studies say, they're more interested in figuring out how to find the information when they need it, rather than learning knowledge for the sake of knowledge. The difference between the just-in-time versus the just-in-case knowledge. Okay, so what happens is we, the professors, who want to teach them to think like lawyers, know that they are coming out of law school to go into a fairly retrospective profession, right? Law is backwards looking. It relies on precedent. It's slow to change. And if you look at the average age of people in there, they are not digital natives. They are not the people who grew up with all this 24/7 technology. If you look at the judges, they're even older on average than the lawyers. And I think the average age of lawyers at the last study I saw was the mid-40s, and I think that probably puts judges in the mid-50s or 60. So while they may be absolutely right and it's time to change and things have to change, they've got to learn to work within the system before they can change the system, because they've got to get in. So my job is to take them where they are and, as resistant as they can be, to persuade them to move, to learn the old way so that they can go in and make it the new way. And that's fine. I tell them, by all means, go and change the world. But you got to get through law school, get admitted to the bar, and get a job and practice law before these people and with these people before you get to do that. So what do I do about the fact that they have a different type of attention span? Don't let anyone tell you they don't have perseverance. Have you ever sat and watched them play 7 hours of video games to beat the level? They have plenty of persistence. It's there. It just has to be motivated. But they are used to multitasking, which is actually, I read something that's much better called switch tasking. The only people who can switch task without a substantial loss or leakage of time and energy and long-term storage are those that are doing something automatic. Something that they have spent over 10,000 hours, according to, it's not Gladwell, but he popularized it, doing so that they've actually become the expert. Now, I, like my mother, think that they're sitting there and multitasking on Facebook probably means they are leaking a lot. On the other hand, they've spent more than 10,000 hours doing that, so I'm not 100% sure. I'm not sure. I know that some of them are definitely leaking. I can see it. I can see the loss switching back and forth. But I'm no longer willing to just say, you can't multitask like that. I do tell them in the first year that first semester of law school, I'm not willing to risk it. You're in contracts. If you get an A in contracts 1 and you know how to do this, by all means, contracts 2. Do it away in the back of the room so you don't bother your classmates. But until you know you can do this, are you really sure you want to take that risk? But so what do I try to do? And as Carol was saying, I am in the process of integrating what most people would call academic support into contracts on a regular basis. And I'm doing it through learning objectives and goals, which, like it or not, you are all going to have to do as soon as the new ABA standards get passed and go into effect, because they're mandating learning objectives, learning outcomes for all of us in this next set of revisions. And when I made my learning outcomes a number of years ago, I realized they were all about things like not just that we're going to learn the substantive law of contracts, but that they were going to learn to define and explain the foundational law and policy of an enforceable promise, that they were going to be able to deconstruct legal rules into component factors or elements, that they were going to be able to identify relevant laws and apply it to new factual situations, that they were going to be able to read and analyze legal opinions or read and analyze statutes or articulate trends or recognize and articulate alternative perspectives or develop learning management skills, one of the things I think is most important, and learn to clearly communicate both orally and in writing. And so as I looked at some of these, where my students are, some of these digital native characteristics versus where I wanted them to go, I knew I had to be very transparent. And so I walk into contracts and I say, this is contracts and contracts is my vehicle. I am using contracts, which is one of the best topics in the world to do this, to teach them how to be a lawyer. It's got all the theory there you want in a really accessible manner. It's got great laws. Some of them are factors. Some of them are elements. It's got great progression. It has a logical overall picture. Contracts is one of the most ideal subject matters to go forth and do first year foundational. But here's an example. I have heard, and I've heard this from my academic support capacity, many students come and say, the professor told me it wasn't about memorization, but then I didn't do well because I hadn't memorized the law. Well, there was a disconnect there. They're just-in-case lawyers. When a professor says law school's not about memorization, they heard I don't need to memorize. That wasn't what most law professors meant. What most law professors meant was that knowing the rule is foundational. That's a prerequisite. We assume you'll know that. You need to know how to do the 7 things that come after that. But the disconnect between what it meant to not have to memorize, I can look it up when I need it, I know where to find it, I recognize it when I see it, made the first year of law school, which is so different to them, very hard. Chris was also talking about the difference between the novice and the expert. I actually give my students a rubric very early on of 1 to 4. Novice to expert. I tell them that the A in my class is not a 4. They all want to think the 4 is the A, the 4-0. No. That's where they're going to be after they're out practicing lawyers. I want them in the first year to get to 2s, maybe some 3s. That would be brilliant. I'm looking for them to go from the novice to competent, to recognize these skills. So what are some of the other things that I like to do with them? I think that one of the most important things is the reflective part. I think that people who have been running on fast forward and computer input and 24/7 have not taken a great deal of time to reflect. So I really encourage reflection on several levels. For example, I'm giving my midterm next week, and there's 3 journaling assignments that go with my midterm. The first they will do before they take the midterm, where they have to assess how they think they prepared, are they ready, etc. As soon as they take the midterm that night, they have to submit another one. What did they think in hindsight having taken it? And then a week to 10 days later when I give it back, they have to do one more. How does that stack up to how they did? One of the most important things in my book of a good lawyer is knowing when you know something well enough to go forward and when you don't. So I want them to start getting good at that. I do homework assignments. I have discovered that the more practice you can give them, the better off they are. I, like many of my colleagues, do not want to grade 68 a day and 36 night assignments every week. So I use a lot of formative feedback with sampling. I have them submit via Dropbox, and then I randomly read 5, put word comments in them, and post them blind so no one knows who they are but me. And then they can see sample answers, whatever. I make them exchange with each other and grade each other on the rubric. They never grade each other themselves very well on the rubric, but they can do it to each other. I make them write the questions. The assignment I did when we finished defenses the other day, I said, take any defense you want and write a multiple choice question. And the 4 choices. And then on a separate piece of paper, write why one is right and why the other 3 are wrong. And then you have to give your question to someone else. They have to take it, and you have to be able to justify your answer. That to them explained more about multiple choice questions and thinking through problems than almost anything else I'd done. As I said, how am I doing on time? Close. Okay. I thought so. Anyway, I have a whole series of other things. I'm happy to talk to anyone about it anytime. But the goal is intentionality and explicit transparency. If we go in and tell them, this is what I'm going to do and this is why I'm going to do it, 1, they're much more receptive. 2, they have the goals or the benchmark or the checklist to know what it is they're trying to do. And 3, we're trying to figure out where our students are and meet them there so we can bring them forward. I'll stop.
So I'm going to pull up John Mayer. I have to say, I hadn't realized quite how techy the whole panel is. I got, just so I can trump Deb, I got a Bachelor of Science in Applied Math because they didn't have computer science when I was in college. They didn't have that department. And I programmed when I had to carry the pack of cards to the computer lab and drop them off at night and come back the next morning and see whether the program ran. So that's for anybody who came in late, this is John Mayer, who got snowed in Chicago. Let's see. All right, now where's anybody? Is it a video? Do I? Oh, there we go. Sound. Help.
Computer system legal instruction, and I'm supposed to be there presenting to you live, but it's actually midnight here in Chicago, and I've gotten back a little while ago from spending 7 hours at the airport, hoping to get on a plane to Miami, but the thunderstorms prevented me from being there. So I'm rebooked on a flight tomorrow, unfortunately without enough time to get there to give this presentation live. So I decided to record this, and hopefully you're watching, and this is going to work out. So, let's take this show on the road. So we're talking about teaching contracts in the digital age, and I'm the non-lawyer here. I'm an engineer, and I've been been the executive director of Cali for 20 years this year, 2014. I started in 1994. I've been in legal education for 25 years, 27 years now. Actually, I started as the IT director at Chicago back in 1987. But I'm going to talk about three things very fast. I'm going to cover a lot of territory: casebook disruption, classroom innovation, and something that I call meta contracts. Let's dive right in. So the casebook world is going through some very major changes, all because of the emergence of the e-book. The old casebooks, well, they were nice, right? They're familiar. They're permanent. They had good user interface elements. Everybody knows how to use a book, and they've been working pretty well for 100 years. But they have some problems. They're expensive. That's probably the number one student complaint: is why do I have to pay $200 for this book? They're permanent, and permanence in this case is actually a downside. And I'll get into that when I talk about the e-book side. They're heavy. We did a survey of students, and the number two reason why they didn't like casebooks was how heavy they were. Having to haul them around in their backpacks and stuff. They're inflexible. I'll talk more about that from the digital side. They have a single user interface. In other words, it's a physical item, so it's only what you get. You can't increase the font. You can't change the way it's viewed. You can't change the background color. All things you can do on a decent ebook reader. And they have a long publishing cycle. It takes 12 to 18 months by the time you've the author's turned in their book before the physical book is available. And sometimes the law or the teaching of law, is a lot faster than that. Now, what about ebooks? Now, I have a picture there of the cover of an ebook that Cali publishes, and I'll talk about that in a second. But generally speaking, ebooks can be and should be, in my belief, less expensive. They can be permanent, but that's an option. It's you can send an ebook to a printer and print it out at any time you want. They're light, electrons don't weigh much. They're flexible, which is to say remixable, which is to say that if you have the permission and you have the software and you have the file, you can add, delete, or change things in the ebook. You can view the book in multiple user interfaces. You can use different types of readers, which is to say different software readers to look at them. You can increase the font. I find I'm not that old, but my eyesight is going, and I find myself constantly hitting the Control Plus on browsers to increase the font size. You can use ebooks on multiple devices. Bring your own device. You can read them on your phone. You can read them on a tablet. You can read them on your computer screen. That gives the students and you lots of flexibility. And best of all, or one of the best things of all, is they can and they should have a shorter publishing cycle. It should be as soon as the author is happy with the work and the publisher is ready to put it up, boom, it's instantly available to everybody in the world from the whole website. So Cali has a project called the E-Wendell Publishing Project, or E-Wendell Press. And it's a ebooks for legal education. We pay faculty to write casebooks. We pay faculty when you're we pay faculty to write casebooks. And then we give them away for free to students under a Creative Commons license. And we publish them in multiple digital formats so that they'll run on Kindles, iPads, they'll be a PDF version. That PDF version can be printed. And in some cases, in most cases, we're working hard on that. We'll also provide a Microsoft Word version because we know that students want to use the book itself as the note-taking tool. We know it's hard to write casebooks and that there's a lot of competition there. But the payment that we will give to people is I believe greater than what most authors will see over the life of their casebook. We also think though that the casebook is starting to come apart, become unbundled, let's say. And so we're even interested in people who want to write that one glorious, excellent chapter. If there's one thing or a group of things that you love to teach, that you think you explain better than anybody else, then talk to us about writing the best darn rulings perpetuities chapter or the best darn offer acceptance chapter that's ever been written. We're interested in that. So Professor Clarke, I believe, is there. I don't know if he's in this session, but we published his book, Contract Doctrine, Theory and Practice, in volumes 1, 2, and 3. We're working with Frank Snyder, who's also published a book with us in contracts. And so that has direct relevance, I hope, for you. You should look at these books and decide whether you want to adopt them for your class. Your students will love you because of their cost and their weight. Oh, here's my Frank Snyder. That's right. So we're not the only game in town, and because we're not a commercial publisher, I more advocate for the idea of the flexibility of electronic books. Harvard has a project called H2O, which is a suite of tools. They're less into the ebook concept and more into the website as course materials. We can develop, remix, and share online textbooks, casebooks, and modules filled with edited cases. Check that out. This is one of their projects that I wanted to highlight. That's looking more Cohen materials for contracts. Semaphore Press is a project out of a couple of law professors where they have an interesting way of charging for books. They let the student download the book for free, but they suggest a donation. And what they found is that most students will pay somewhere between $15 and $25 per book, which is certainly less than the typical law school casebook. They say they're $180, and they're willing to sign people up to work with them. You may have seen or heard about Eric Goldman, who wrote a book and wrote an interesting article about this in Forbes. I think it was last year. Yes, that's in September. Self-publishing the legal casebook and ebook success story. Rebecca Tushnet was his co-author, and it was a casebook in a niche area, a casebook on advertising and marketing law. A perfect example of why ebooks are a better way, in my opinion, for publishing materials. Instead, the future of casebooks is really course materials. They're being pulled apart and put onto websites. You know, that might be Twin or your blog site or your legal your LMS, your management system, where your courses are posted, where you put links into PDFs or links into Word files or links into the PowerPoints that you let your students see either a week before the class starts or at the beginning of the course. But this to me is the future of where this is going. And this hands more power over to you as the faculty member and more control over to the student to construct their own educational environment. And to me, that's all good. So that kind of leads me into the next one, which is classroom innovation. Let me start with this article from EduBlog, where they listed the 10 biggest ed tech trends of the year. I talked about ebooks and OER, but the two I want to kick in on very quickly on this is flipped classrooms and learning analytics. And I'm going to twist this a little bit, but I'll get to that in a second. So first of all, flipped classrooms. If you don't know what a flipped classroom is, it's basically this. A flipped classroom is a form of blended learning, which the students learn new content online by watching a video. So the students watch a 10-minute or 20-minute video before coming to class, and you use the classroom time instead for project-based learning. In other words, the basic delivery of the doctrine, the black letter law, is up to the student to consume as they see fit before they get to class, so that you can interact with them inside the classroom. Now, there's actually an awful lot going on in this space. University of Utah, especially a fellow by the name of Aaron DeWald, is creating collections of canonical videos. He has quite a few in contracts, in fact, and that's why I wanted to highlight this. And they're calling it the project The First Year. And you can find it at thefirstyear.org. You should check those out. The videos are very basic, and that's not a bad thing. It's intended to walk the students slowly through the material so that they get the basics. And that way they come into class prepared to talk about deeper, more complex things. Michelle Pistone at Villanova is also working on a website called Legal EdWeb, in which she's encouraging people to flip their classrooms, to create videos, and to share them with others. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Cali lessons. I think Cali lessons were the original flipped classroom. The idea being that the student would run through the lessons. They're interactive, web-based tutorials. Jennifer Martin, who is the organizer of this conference, has written many lessons for us and is on my board of directors. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And we have almost 100 contracts lessons that cover all sorts of topics. Our goal has always been to make the lessons short. They run 20 to 40 minutes for the student to complete. And they're interactive. They ask questions. They branch. They give feedback. They don't hide the ball. And if the students run them before they show up to class, then they're much smarter and more able to discuss deeper ideas in regards to the material. So, okay, that's what I wanted to say about flipped classrooms. Learning analytics. Learning analytics in the big sense is about data, about learning progress. But I want to narrow this focus down to something that I think is going to become very prominent in legal education in the next couple of years, and that's what I call formative assessment. A formative assessment is feedback that the student gets or that the instructor gets that tells them how well they're doing. In other words, it's not high-stakes testing, it's low-stakes, it's feedback, it's formative. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, it's graded without the grade being recorded on your permanent record. The screen up I have is for Cali lessons. Cali lessons are classic formative assessment because you answer a question and you get feedback right away that tells you whether you got it right or wrong. Although many of our authors also create a maybe response. Lesson link is a feature of Cali lessons where the instructor can create a personal link to a lesson that when the student runs the lesson, the instructor can see the student's results. And so it's a way of the student, it's a way for the faculty member to see how well their teaching is going or how well their class is tracking what they're doing. If they're not doing well, then maybe that's something that they should change about their teaching or review before the final exam or deal with in some other way. This is an article, Empirical Evidence That Formative Assessments Improve Final Exams. I found it extremely interesting. I highly recommend it all for your reading. Cali is working on something that will make formative assessment easier for law faculty. I can't talk about it very much because I don't have all the details, but I know of other efforts going on in the legal education community to add formative assessment or to increase the amount of formative assessment in legal education. This idea of going 14 weeks or 15 weeks and then a final exam that is the entirety of your grade is just something that is not working out very well. All right, finish up. Meta contracts. And meta, what I mean here is it's not about learning how to write a contract. It's about how writing of contracts and how dealing with contracts or the construction of legal documents by lawyers is changing due to technology. Now, you're watching this hopefully after lunch, and Kingsley Martin has already given his lunchtime talk, and so I don't have to say much about contract standards. I was delighted to see that he was on the agenda. I'll just leave that up there as that. If he wasn't there, then I would have said more about how he's making people rethink that not every contract is a built from scratch product. There are an increasing number of startups, companies out there. Shake is an example of one, in which it's an app, in which they intend to make contracts simple. They intend to make contracts simple and make the execution of them extremely simple. Shake is an app on your phone where you can create, sign, and send legally binding agreements in seconds. They've gotten a lot of attention. I don't know whether they're going to be around in a year or two, but they're a model that you're going to see lots of examples of. These are the types of companies, and these are the types of environment that your students are going to be practicing. An environment in which contracting is done on your, with an app on your phone. So this is a company called Business Integrity, but it's actually, they have a product called Contract Express, and I'll highlight that they have a tool for document assembly that allows you to create self-service contracts. In other words, you go through, it asks you questions, you fill out some forms, and boopity-boop, out the end comes a completed document that you can then take for review to a lawyer, or that in some cases can directly use yourself. You're going to see a lot. I was just at Legal Tech New York, and there was at least a dozen of these firms on the exhibit floor selling products that are for lawyers who produce lots of documents, and they're not going to create them all from scratch. Direct Law is a company. This is an example of a whole class of companies for virtual law practice. And I only wanted to point out that almost all of these virtual law firm websites include the ability to do document automation, and that means the automatic creation or the standard creation of things like contracts or licenses. So this is the type of thing. This is where your students will be practicing from. They will be meeting with clients, but they will also be engaging or maybe even doing unbundled practice with clients, via a website. This is an article from the American Bar Association last year by Stephanie Kimball. You should read everything that she writes, in which more and more the students are going to be practicing in a space in which they don't handle soup to nuts the issue. They may be called in for only the part where they draft or only the part where they review the contract. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, what does that mean in terms of your teaching? What type of understandings or what types of knowledge or what types of bigger meta picture do the students have to have about contracting and contract language, given this different and new environment that is emerging. So that's pretty much my talk. I appreciate you listening. I'll be around to answer questions. I've included in the slideshow all the links that I had from the thing, and so feel free to take a look or drop me an email if you have any questions about anything I said. Thank you very
much. So, Kingsley said he would prefer, just since we have a limited amount of time, to just open it up for questions, and he can comment or add things if you want to direct questions related to the. And actually, it's helpful that John Mayer ended up just at exactly that same place anyway. So, we'll open it for questions and comments.
I just want to say first, despite all the deadlines I have missed, you heard Cali wave all of those pictures so far. I want to address the issue about the way students have trouble focusing in the way that my generation was taught to focus over the single book. And what occurs to me is, I'm not sure that's a bad thing that you're spending more time multitasking, because from the lawyer's perspective, when I was practicing law, the client comes up with a problem, they walk in the door, they hand you a problem, you solve it, the client goes away. So you're handling things serially for the client. You focus. The client's world is multitasking all the time. You have problems with immigration problems at the same time you're dealing with budget problems, at the same time you're dealing with the alcohol beverage board, at the same time you're dealing with an employee who's threatening to sue you. All those things go on at the same time. And I think the skill to be able to balance all of those things is probably less valuable in the big firm context, where you're going to have to spend weeks writing on some incredibly important issue. But may not be a bad thing for those who are going to go out and practice ordinary lawyers. We would keep balls in the air as a huge
I'll start by saying that I think it depends on how you define multitasking. The multitasking that people are having a problem with is the instantaneous, where you stop what you're doing to answer an email and then go back to what you're doing, and what you lose in the cycles of reorienting yourself to that paragraph of reading when you stopped, or then the phone rang, or did you even remember to go back. So there are degrees of multitasking. Yes, our students need, all students on entering, particularly if they haven't had real world experience, need a lot of practice in learning to juggle. How many people have had the students who had a legal research assignment due, so they didn't get to anything else that night? And they need to learn, and I repeatedly tell them, your client, summary judgment motion, you're going to be writing 3 of those in a week. And so that is a skill they need to learn. But again, they're novices. And I think one of the hardest things that we as faculty have to remember is it's been a while since most of us were novices. We've been doing what we do a long time, a lot of us. And we're very good at it, and we forget how basic we need to take it back to let them learn. First year of law school is the equivalent of learning to read for them. It's the equivalent of the alphabet of law.
The other thing is, there's always, I'm not sure that's on. No? Okay.
I'll just jump. In the first year, I feel like I'm always in this tug of war about getting students to read more deeply. And they think they are reading deeply because they're standing on a concrete floor that they can't see beneath, so they figure they got down to the bottom. But I want to show them the basement and the sub-basement. And my line is that most disputes occur in the sub-basement. It's very seldom that lawyers litigate truly big picture disagreements. It's much more about those little nitty-gritty things. And so if I've got a student who walks into class and misses the exception to the rule because they didn't read the text closely enough, then I want to know what it is that's keeping them from getting that deeper understanding. And so while we're in the first year, I want to develop those deep reading skills so that by the second year, when I get them in sales or whatever other course I'm teaching them, I'm not still fighting those battles. And so I think there's a difference between the sort of novice test and teaching them how to drill down below that seemingly concrete floor versus later on learning to juggle more and more things. And she's right about the first year. Students all the time say, oh, couldn't do anything else besides doing legal writing this week. It's like, no, you're going to have many more files than that. Let's not play that game. So there is a balance to be struck here. It's not either or, but there's important skills on both sides, I think.
Just a quick perspective. First of all, it's reality.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just multitasking. It's the fact that we work in a very noisy environment. Lots of inputs around us. But I heard something recently that really struck me. The presentation that Michael Vasson and a bunch of people put together for the ABA, and one of the participants was a young law student who actually offered a perspective that was really quite interesting. It's in our environment when we think about this communication, we expect them to have 100% dedication. But what this person was saying, which I thought was so interesting, is that we don't know how to communicate with someone behind glass. If we could actually, we were communicating as I normally do through WebEx, JoinMe, and Skype, then this is just the world, the noisy world that we live in. If we're trying to sort of take it out of their space in this kind of environment, that's just not normal to them. I'm sitting at home and I'm talking to friends all around the world. It's noisy, but in that we actually are communicating. No, you do need the time for reflection, and that may well have got lost in the mix. But A is reality. Two, I think we can actually communicate. You can actually join them in their space, as opposed to expecting them to come into your space and 100% attention.
I wanted to go back to your comment about just in time versus just in case. It seems to me a lot of what lawyers do is just in time, right? You get a problem, you haven't learned about that before, and you have to figure it out.
Yeah.
And we're perhaps forcing them in the just in case mode, at least a little bit, on the theory that you need this basic understanding so that you can process later what comes in the door.
Well, at a level, you don't go and read every book, but you have to learn the alphabet and the basics of reading. They have to have a foundation of, and why do we teach what we teach in the first year, and why, even as we change our curriculum, are we keeping a lot of certain courses? I mean, property, torts, and contracts, right? They make up the foundational principles that take you all the way through commercial law, family law. I mean, so many areas of law that base on those concepts. We don't expect them to memorize all of the laws, but we expect them to understand how we derive the laws and basic concepts so that when a new concept comes in, they understand how to approach it and how to go forward. They need to work with an understanding of certain concepts in order to learn the other skills, in order to be able to go out and extrapolate.
I agree fully with that. And my question is, do they not understand that? Is that what we're not telling them?
Yes. That's one of the things we're not telling them.
This is a really mundane question. Sorry I'm asking it, but given that you've all spoken so thoughtfully about multitasking and distractions and whatnot, there's still a debate about laptops in the classroom, and I'm just wondering if you could comment on it, or whether to allow them.
I see the arguments pro and con. I'd let them come in on balance because I think that it's less detrimental than not. But I do love the classes where occasionally I'll just say, don't bring it. Just bring your brain, and we're just going to do a brainstorming session. There won't be any notes needed from it. But I don't think I want to be doing
I'm going to add one comment. I have a colleague who bans laptops in his classroom, and initially there seemed to be a lot of it's a first year class, and there was a lot of pushback, but very quickly the reaction was, I'm so glad he did that. It makes so much sense. It frustrates me, but the students seem to like it, and I think it depends on the nature of how much note taking they need to do and how much you give them where they need to write it down or not. I mean, I haven't done a study. There's someone who did a study and published on the reaction of students that suggested students, by and large, like it. Some need that in order to write anything down. I understand that my own handwriting has deteriorated over the years, but
They've said that handwriting has gone to, penmanship has been replaced with keyboard. conferences, a bunch of us did a panel on laptops in the classroom. This was back when we were at Duke, and I don't remember how many years ago that was, but it was a long time ago. The problem with laptops in the classroom are different problems. One is internet-connected laptops, which most are nowadays, versus just laptops. Students who have not been taught to take notes for law school tend to try to take dictation if they have a keyboard. And one of the reasons I've gone to several formative assessments and a midterm and a lot of stuff is to get them to try different things. If it's not working then, I say, okay, try taking notes by hand for a week, see if that works. And we have assessments and often enough that they can begin to see if different minds work different ways. Because regardless of whatever generalities you can make, everyone grew up differently and everybody's brain works differently and everyone's constructing knowledge in their own brain at their own speed. So some people really do need, for learning disability or just the way they've always done it, to see it on a screen, to type it. Some people do better writing it. The problem is the distraction when they're doing other things on it. I usually ignore it until other students complain, and then I tell those students to take it to the back of the classroom or get out, or close the laptop. You're not allowed to infringe on someone else. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to follow up on Kingsley's comment, and in some respects, it's a preempt Meredith's question. She's already heard this. I've become a bit of a missionary of late on online synchronous classrooms. Not for everything, but used in some circumstances. For example, in New York, we've all killed off about 5 days of classes this year because of the blizzards. My classes meet. We just meet online instead. I think Casey's point's important because our students that we're teaching today are going to be practicing law on WebEx. And so if I'm teaching at least some of their classes on WebEx or Adobe Connect or Blackboard Collaborate, any of the synchronous platforms, they're comfortable talking about law. They're comfortable thinking in that environment. The other thing it does, and I absolutely agree with your point, that when we move from the traditional physical world to the digital world, the fact is you can do almost everything. I call on students. They raise their hands. I cold call on them. I have them do collaborative projects. I send them off into breakout rooms. I go check in on different breakout rooms. You can do all of those things. In fact, you can do some things better. If you want to flip the classroom, you know what, I don't need clickers. The clickers are built into my online classroom. I can do formative assessments at the end of class. I do usually a couple of polls to see if they got this stuff. Again, you can do individual work group sessions. So I think one of the things, instead of fighting the technology, it's not just that lawyers need to quit worrying about the technology and not fight it. We need to quit worrying about the technology and work with it and avoid things like makeups when you have bad weather days. And I'm teaching my first full online JD course this summer. And I encourage any of you who haven't tried a full online live classroom, try it. You'll be amazed at what you can do with it. In fact, William Mitchell, as I understand it, is starting to do a fair bit with a whole new program. There are amazing opportunities there. So again, if you haven't tried it, this is really more just a comment. I encourage you to do so.
I'll just say, I would also, before you do an online course, I would recommend you take one. I took an online course, and then I took a course on teaching online courses. And I think that there are some wonderful things about it, and I think that there are still some design issues that need to really be worked on. It depends on what your goals are for a particular issue. It's very, I have mixed feelings about it having sat through one as the student.
Yeah, feeling the frustration and the terror on the other side makes a valuable experience for a teacher.
And I've only done MOOCs, admittedly. I have not said, I've done some MOOCs. I haven't said on a full class, but I can tell you, third and fourth hand, where it didn't come back directly to me with the two who you worried. To date, my students have been uniformly thrilled with the experience. So I understand that there are concerns, and I understand you've got to work at it to make it work. But I'm not sure the students are as worried about it as we are.
I'm not bad-mouthing it when I say that. I'm saying it'll make you a better teacher if you sit on the other side and watch where things go wrong you won't see them as easily because of the glass.
I agree, and I'd love to have that opportunity.
Yeah.
I've had very little experience, but what I've found, I've done a few courses as an adjunct, and I've done one actually with John with a MOOC. The level of interactivity through the online is 1,000 times greater, because I'm a sort of, although a immigrant, completely just happy in that environment, and so are they. And in fact, the interaction was just unbelievable, continuous. I mean, we are multitasking. Questions are coming in on a Twitter feed. I'm talking through.
Yes. Well, this is refreshment, so we need to stop and thank the panel.